Lonely rancher found a young Apache girl hanging on a tree with a sign, "White man, don't forgive." The sun in the Arizona territory didn't just shine, it punished. It hammered the earth into a cracked canvas of reds and ochres, bleaching the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue. The silence out here wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, waiting thing, broken only by the sigh of the wind and the scuttle of a lizard over hot stone. And into this silence rode Jacob Prentice, a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the mesas that guarded the horizon. His face was a leathery map of 60-odd hard years, each line etched by sun, loss, and solitude. He rode an old mare, its pace as slow and deliberate as the man himself. They moved through the scrubland not like conquerors, but like ghosts, leaving barely a trace. He was following a fence line, a crooked, sagging thing that was more a suggestion of a boundary than a real barrier. His eyes, pale and set deep under the brim of a worn hat, scanned the posts with a practiced weariness. This was his ritual, a pointless chore, really. There was nothing on the other side of this fence that wanted what was on his side. Nothing but dust and memories. He tugged on a loose wire, the twang a lonely sound in the vastness. His ranch, a cluster of buildings barely visible in the distance, seemed less like a home and more like a scar on the land. He lived there alone. He preferred it that way. Solitude was a known quantity. It was people that brought trouble. A sound prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. Faint, high-pitched. He stopped, his body going still. He tilted his head, listening past the buzz of flies and the whisper of the wind. It was a hawk, a rabbit caught in a predator's jaw, but his gut, an instrument finely tuned by survival, told him it was neither. It was a sound that didn't belong. His eyes swept the horizon, past the scrub and the saguaro cacti, until they settled on a lone willow tree. It was an anomaly, a testament to some hidden source of water, its green leaves a shocking defiance against the parched landscape. It stood sentinel over a dry creek bed, a place he usually avoided. And there was something wrong. Something was hanging from its lowest, thickest branch. A dark shape, too small for a deer, too still for an animal. A deep frown creased Jacob's brow. Trouble. The word echoed in his mind, cold and certain. Every instinct screamed at him to turn the mare around, to ride back to the empty, silent safety of his cabin, to not see whatever was swinging from that tree. But his feet were stubborn. They had carried him through worse. He nudged the mare forward, the horse's hooves crunching softly on the gravel. The distance closed with an agonizing slowness. The shape began to resolve itself. It was a child, a small figure tied at the wrists, hanging limply. A girl, her dark hair matted with dust. Her head was drooped forward, her feet dangling a few useless inches from the ground. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. A cold fury, an old and familiar companion, warred with a sudden, sharp pang of pity. He was close enough now to see the raw, bloody rings around her wrists, to see the faint, desperate rise and fall of her chest. And then he saw the sign, a piece of weathered wood, hung around her neck by a coarse rope. Crudely carved letters, burned deep into the grain, spelled out a message that struck him like a physical blow. "White man, don't forgive." The words hung in the air, more condemning than any scripture. They weren't just a message, they were a judgment. On her, on him, on every pale face that had ever crossed this land. His hand, calloused and trembling slightly, went to the rifle in his scabbard. His first thought was of an ambush. His eyes darted to the surrounding rocks, searching for a glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel, a shadow that didn't fit. But there was nothing, just the immense, watching silence. He looked back at the girl, so small, so broken, left as a warning, a lesson in hatred. A memory, long buried, flashed behind his eyes. A child's laughter, ringing through this very land. A laughter silenced forever. The pain of it was a fresh wound, even after all these years. He was a white man, and the sign said, "White men don't forgive." Maybe it was right. Maybe the bitterness that had kept him company for 2 decades was all the forgiveness he had left to give. To leave her would be to agree with the sign, to become the very thing it accused him of being. He let out a long, ragged sigh, the sound swallowed by the desert. It was a sigh of surrender, not to an enemy, but to the last flickering ember of his own humanity. "Damn fool thing to do, Prentice," he muttered, the words rough and dry in his throat. He swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He drew his knife, the blade catching the sun. He approached the tree slowly, each step a decision. He reached up and sawed through the ropes at her wrists. She was light as a husk of corn as she fell into his arms. He laid her gently on the sparse grass beneath the willow, his movements awkward, unpracticed in tenderness. He untied the hateful sign from her neck and stared at it. "White man don't forgive." He wanted to smash it, to throw it into the dry creek and let the next flash flood carry it to hell. But he didn't. Instead, he tucked it into his saddlebag. A reminder, a burden. He lifted the unconscious girl onto his horse, mounting up behind her, holding her small frame secure against him. He turned the mare toward home, the willow tree shrinking behind them. But the words of the sign seemed to chase him, echoing in the stillness, a question he didn't know how to answer. A question that, from this moment on, would define them both. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of dread and slow-burning disbelief. The girl's small weight against Jacob's chest was a foreign sensation, a stark contrast to the usual empty miles. He kept expecting to hear a shout, the crack of a rifle shot from a hidden ridge, punishment for this act of interference. But the only sound was the mare's steady plodding and the ragged rhythm of his own breath. As the cabin came into view, a low-slung structure of weathered timber hunched against the encroaching desert, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage he was willingly locking himself inside. He pushed the heavy door open, the groan of its hinges a familiar complaint. The interior was swallowed by shadows and the thick, stale smell of old wood smoke, coffee grounds, and loneliness. He carried the girl to his bed, a narrow cot in the corner, and laid her down on the rough wool blanket. She was so still, so pale beneath the grime. The first order of business was light. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the room's stark details. The cold, ash-filled fireplace, the single chair, the shelves of meager supplies. He lit a kerosene lamp, and its warm, wavering glow pushed back the gloom, making the shadows dance instead of brood. Then he worked. His hands, more accustomed to gripping a rifle stock or mending a harness, were clumsy with a bucket of water and a cleanish rag. He dampened the cloth and began to gently wipe the dust and dried sweat from the girl's face. She stirred, a faint moan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, and the fear he saw there was a physical force. It was not the simple fear of a stranger, but a deep, ancestral terror. She scrambled backward on the bed, pressing herself against the rough-hewn log wall, her breath coming in sharp, panicked hitches. She spoke, the words tumbling out in a rapid, melodic stream of Apache. He understood none of the words, but the meaning was as clear as glass. Stay away. He raised his hands, palms out, the universal sign of surrender. He took a slow step back. "I don't know what you're saying, girl," he said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. It sounded strange in the quiet cabin, an intrusion. "I ain't gonna hurt you." He gestured to the cup of water he'd set on the crate beside the bed. She stared at it with a desperate thirst, but made no move to take it. Distrust was a stronger instinct than survival. He tried again. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at his own chest. "Jacob," he said, the name feeling unfamiliar on his tongue. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. She just watched him, a wildness in her dark eyes. He pointed to her, a questioning look on his face. A long moment passed. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, a word escaped her. Kesh. It was a name, a gift of identity, a tiny, fragile thread connecting them. He nodded slowly. Kesh. His eyes then fell upon the sign. He had leaned it against the stone fireplace, and in the flickering lamplight, the carved words seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. "White man, don't forgive." It was an accusation aimed at his entire being. It felt like it was burning a hole in his very soul. He strode over, snatched it up, and moved to throw it into the fireplace. He would reduce it to ash, destroy its poisonous message. But his arm froze mid-swing. The words, they weren't just words. They were a story, a reason. Someone had carved this with hate in their heart. To burn it was to pretend that hate didn't exist, to ignore the truth of why this child was hanging from a tree. It felt like a coward's way out. With a grunt of frustration, he pulled it back from the flames. The lower edge was slightly charred, a permanent scar. He set it back against the hearth, a dark totem he couldn't bring himself to destroy. The action stirred a memory, one he kept locked away in the deepest part of himself. It surged forward unbidden. A memory, 20 years younger. The cabin is new, the pine logs still smelling sweet. A woman with kind eyes and a sun-freckled face, Mary, is laughing, hanging a calico curtain in the window. A little boy, Tommy, no more than 5, chases a barn kitten across the freshly swept floor. The room is filled with light, with hope, with the future. Jacob, his face unlined and his heart full, puts an arm around Mary, pulling her close. This was all he ever wanted. The memory was so vivid, so painful, he physically flinched. His eyes darted to the mantelpiece, to a small, dust-covered daguerreotype that was turned face down. He had turned it down the day he buried them. He couldn't bear to see their smiles, to be reminded of what was taken. He looked from the photograph to the terrified girl on his bed and back to the sign. The silence in the cabin was broken by a new sound, a soft, muffled crying. Kesh had given up her defiant posture. She was curled into a ball, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It was the sound of absolute, world-ending despair. It was a sound Jacob knew. It was the sound he had made, alone in this very cabin, for months on end after the Apache raiding party had taken everything from him. The cold, hard stone of his heart cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough. He didn't approach her. He didn't try to offer empty comfort. Instead, he dragged his chair to the far side of the room, the legs scraping harshly against the wooden floor. He sat down, heavily, and laid his rifle across his lap. Not as a threat to her, but as a promise. He would sit guard, not against her, but for her, against the world that had done this, against the ghosts in his own walls. And so the night wore on. 2 wounded souls, separated by language, by culture, by a history of violence, held captive in a small circle of lamplight. One sleeping fitfully, the other keeping watch, both prisoners of a past written on a piece of wood, and a future that had not yet found its words. The first light of dawn pried its way through the single grimy window of the cabin, painting a dusty gold bar across the floor. Jacob awoke with a stiff neck, his body protesting a night spent in the hard wooden chair. The rifle was still across his lap, a cold, dead weight. Kesh was awake too. She was sitting up on the edge of the bed, watching him. The raw, panic terror in her eyes had receded, replaced by a watchful, deep-seated wariness. She was a creature assessing its cage, calculating the moods of its keeper. An unspoken routine began that day, built on a foundation of silence and distance. Jacob moved, and Kesh watched. He fried some salt pork, the sizzle loud in the quiet. He placed a plate of it on the crate beside the bed, along with a piece of hardtack. He then pointedly turned his back, busying himself at the stove with his own portion. When he glanced back, the food was gone. She ate like a feral animal, quickly and quietly, never taking her eyes off him. He went outside to his chores, and when he returned an hour later, the plate was licked clean. It was progress. A transaction. He provided food. She didn't starve. It was the most basic contract of civilization. The next day, the heat was a crushing weight. The old water pump by the well, a stubborn relic, chose to seize up entirely. Jacob wrestled with the rusty handle, his muscles straining. It groaned and protested, emitting a dry, gasping sound but not a drop of water. Sweat poured down his temples, his frustration mounting with each futile thrust. He cursed under his breath, a low, guttural string of grievances against the pump, the heat, and his own luck. He didn't notice Kesh standing in the doorway, drawn by the noise. She observed for a long time, her head tilted. Then she took a few hesitant steps out into the yard, the first time she had voluntarily left the cabin. She pointed a small, thin finger at the pump's priming valve, a part he'd ignored. She made a gentle, circular motion with her hand. Jacob stopped, panting, and frowned at her. What? She pointed more insistently at the valve, then mimed pouring water from a bucket into it, and finally mimed the smooth, easy motion of the pump handle. He was skeptical. What could a child know about this? But his way wasn't working. With a shrug that was more surrender than agreement, he found a bucket of water and poured it into the valve she indicated. He then grabbed the handle again. This time, with a great shudder and a sucking sound, the pump gave in. A gush of clear, cold water splashed into the bucket below. The sound was a miracle in the desert heat. Jacob stared at the flowing water, then at the girl. A look of pure, unadulterated astonishment broke through his usual grim mask. A chuckle, rough and unused, escaped his throat. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. He filled the dipper and held it out to her. This time, she didn't recoil. She approached slowly and took it from his hands. She drank deeply, the water trickling down her chin. For a fleeting second, as their eyes met over the rim of the dipper, there was no fear, no suspicion. There was only the shared, simple satisfaction of a problem solved. A common language found not in words, but in action. Later, he led her to the small, slow-moving creek that bordered his land. He figured she needed to wash, to feel clean. He sat on a large, sun-warmed rock, giving her space. She knelt by the water's edge, her hands skimming the surface. She seemed to draw strength from it. Then she pointed to the water itself. "Sha," she said, her voice clear and firm. He understood. He repeated it, his tongue stumbling over the soft, unfamiliar syllable. "Sha." A miracle occurred. The ghost of a smile, there and gone so fast he might have imagined it, touched her lips. She pointed to the rock he was sitting on. Say, he repeated more confidently. He pointed to the vast, blue expanse above them. "Sky." She looked up and then back at him and nodded. "Sky." And so a new world was built, word by word, on the banks of that creek. Horse was his word. That was hers. Sunday moon. Fire. They became archaeologists of communication, excavating meaning from gesture and sound. He learned her name. Kesh meant star dancer. He didn't tell her that Jacob meant he who supplants. It felt like a name for a different man, a man from a story that had ended badly. That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The silence was no longer heavy. It was contemplative. He heated a can of beans, and they ate together, him at his small table, her on the edge of the bed. There was no longer a need for him to turn his back. When it was time to sleep, he looked at the chair, then at the rifle. He picked up the weapon, and for a long moment, he held it. It had been his constant companion, his security against the world. But tonight it felt out of place. It was a tool for the old silence, not for this new, fragile peace. He walked over to the peg by the door and hung the rifle on it. The action was deliberate, final. He then walked to his chair and sat down, preparing for another night of watch. But his eyes kept drifting to the face-down photograph on the mantel. He didn't turn it over. Not yet. That would be a step too far, a betrayal of a different kind. But for the first time in 20 years, he thought of the people in that picture not with a pain that crippled him, but with a quiet, distant ache. The memory was still there, but it no longer felt like an open wound. In the darkness, he could hear Kesh's breathing, slow and even. She was asleep, and for the first time since he found her hanging from that tree, Jacob Prentice felt not like a warden, but like a guardian. A week passed, and the rhythm of the ranch changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet industry of two people learning to orbit one another. Jacob taught Kesh how to feed the chickens, her small hands scattering grain with a seriousness that made him hide a smile. She, in turn, showed him how to find the sharp, pungent leaves of a desert plant that could soothe the raw skin on his knuckles. They were a pair of magnets, sometimes repelling, sometimes attracting, slowly finding a polarity that worked. One afternoon, they rode out into the foothills to check on the small, scrubby herd of cattle that constituted Jacob's wealth. He'd fashioned a makeshift saddle for her on the old mare, and she rode in front of him, her small body swaying with the horse's gait. She was watching everything. The way a hawk circled, the pattern of a jackrabbit's track in the dust, the subtle shift in the wind. She pointed to a bank of clouds gathering over the distant mountains. "Rain comes," she said, her English still halting but clear. Jacob squinted at the sky. "Not for a day or two. Winds from the wrong direction." She shook her head, insistent. "The birds are low. The ants build high. Rain comes." She spoke not as a child guessing, but as someone reading a book she had known all her life. He didn't argue. He was learning to trust her eyes, to see the world through them. It was a world more alive, more articulate than the one he'd inhabited alone. They found a patch of shade under a rocky overhang to rest a horse and eat some jerky. The easy silence between them was comfortable now. It was then that Jacob's gaze fell on his saddlebag, where the corner of the wooden sign still protruded. The peace of the moment evaporated, replaced by a grim tension. He had avoided it, but it was the unspoken question at the heart of everything. He couldn't build a new world on a foundation he didn't understand. He pulled the sign out. The charred edge from his near burning was a dark smear. He held it up, the words, "White man don't forgive," glaring in the sunlight. He didn't point to it aggressively, but as a question. He looked at Kesh, his eyes asking what his words could not. Her face, which had been open and calm, shut down instantly. The wariness returned, a shield slamming into place. She looked from the sign to his face, and he saw a terrible conflict there. The memory was a poison, but his quiet, patient presence was an antidote. Could she trust him with the poison? He laid the sign on the ground between them, a silent invitation. He would not force her. Kesh stared at the carved letters, her small hands clenched into fists. She began to speak, not in English, but in a low, rhythmic flow of Apache. The words were a river of pain, and though he didn't understand them, he felt their current. Her voice trembled, then steadied with a fierce pride. Then she began to translate, weaving her story with broken English, with gestures that were more powerful than any speech. She pointed to herself. "Kesh, my father, Haston." She gestured with her hand high, indicating a leader, a chief. She drew a circle in the dirt. A village. She placed small stones inside it, her people. She spoke of a time of quiet, of hunting, of watching the seasons turn. Then her hand swept away the stones. She picked up a different, sharper stone. She gestured with it like a knife. "Billigana. White men. Not like Jacob," she indicated, but with hard eyes and greed in their hearts. "Miners. They had come before," she explained, and her father had caught one stealing a sacred object. But her father was a man of peace. He had let the man go. She struggled for the word. "Forgive," Jacob offered, the word feeling strange and heavy. She nodded. "Forgive." But the miners had returned, not for forgiveness, but for gold they believed was hidden in the sacred places of her people. Her father stood before them again, not with a rifle, but with open hands. He spoke of the forgiveness he had already given. He asked for peace. "Here," Kesh's voice broke. She mimicked a man laughing, a cruel, mocking sound. She then acted out the horror. The sudden crack of rifles. The falling bodies. The warriors her uncles cut down. Her father, standing his ground, was the last to fall. She was left. They tied her. They carved a sign. One of the miners, his face a mask of hate, had held it up to her. "Your chief forgave," he snarled in a language she barely understood. "But white men don't forgive. We take. Remember that." They hung the sign around her neck and left her on the willow tree as their final, twisted lesson. The sign was not just a message. It was her father's philosophy, his belief in forgiveness, mocked and perverted by the very men he had spared. When she finished, she was not crying. She was sitting with a stillness that was more profound than any tears. She had emptied the poison out. Jacob listened, his own breath caught in his chest. He saw not an Apache, but a child who had watched her world be murdered. The story echoed in the hollow places inside him, finding a terrible kinship. He looked away, out over the vast land. His own pain, a festering, private thing for 20 years, suddenly demanded voice. It felt crude, selfish after her story. But it was the only truth he had to offer in return. My family, he began, the words scraping out of him. My wife, Mary, my boy Tommy. He pointed a trembling hand toward the ranch, his vision blurring. I was away, getting supplies. A 2-day ride. When I came back, he didn't have to act it out. The devastation on his face told the story. The cabin was smoke. The bodies were gone. The Apache raiding party had left nothing but ashes and silence. I wasn't here, he whispered, the guilt as fresh as it had been on that first day. I found nothing. The two confessions hung in the air between them. Her story of murder by white miners. His story of murder by Apache raiders. They were not opposites. They were not enemies. They were the same. Two souls, orphaned by the same wheel of violence and revenge, sitting in the shadow of a rock, one holding a sign that condemned the other, yet now bound together by the very pain it represented. The sign wasn't a wall between them anymore. It was a bridge, built from the wreckage of both their worlds. The shared confession under the rocky overhang had changed everything. The air between Jacob and Kesh was no longer thick with the ghosts of their separate pasts, but with the fragile weight of a shared present. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was deep but not heavy. It was the silence of two people carrying a precious, delicate thing, careful not to drop it. But the world outside their small circle had not changed. The men who had left Kesh for dead were still out there. The sign, now tucked back into the saddlebag, was not just a story. It was a warrant for her arrest from a ruthless, unofficial court. That evening, as Jacob cleaned his rifle, the action felt different. It wasn't just maintenance anymore. It was preparation. He watched Kesh by the fireplace, tracing the charred edge of the sign with a small finger, her face thoughtful. He could not keep her here indefinitely. This was not a life. It was a hiding place. And hiding places, in his experience, were always found. Kesh, he said, his voice firm. She looked up. He gestured to the west. Fort Defiance. 2 days' ride. Soldiers. They can protect you. Find your people. He saw the immediate flash of fear in her eyes. Soldiers. Billigana soldiers. To her, they were no different from the miners. They were just men in uniforms with the same hard eyes. She shook her head vehemently. No, bad men. They're not all, he started, but the words died in his throat. How could he convince her? His own experiences with the army had been distant, transactional. He had no proof of their honor. He only knew that the danger here was certain. The danger there was unknown. It was a terrible calculation. We have to try, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was the voice of a man who saw no other path. The next morning, they set out before dawn, the air cold and sharp. Jacob rode tense, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the arroyos, the stands of juniper. Kesh sat behind him now, her small arms wrapped around his waist. She was not a passenger. She was a second set of eyes, her head constantly turning, reading the land with an ancient literacy he could never hope to match. They entered the mouth of Serpent Canyon, a narrow, winding cut through the sandstone cliffs. It was the fastest route to the fort, but a notorious place for an ambush. The high walls cast deep, purple shadows even as the sun rose higher. The only sounds were the clop of the mare's hooves, echoing off the stone, and the nervous chirping of crickets. It was Kesh who felt it first. Her grip on his shirt tightened. She went rigid. Horse, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Many. Jacob reined in the mare, his heart hammering against his ribs. He listened. At first, nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, he heard it. The jingle of a bit, the crunch of gravel under a shod hoof. Someone was ahead, around the next bend. He cursed under his breath. To turn back now would be suspicious, and they'd be easily chased down in the open desert. His only hope was to press on, to appear as nothing more than a rancher and his... what? His daughter? The lie would not hold. It was too late. 3 riders emerged from around the bend, blocking the narrow trail. Jacob recognized them instantly from Kesh's description. They were the miners. Their clothes were dirty, their faces hard and unshaven. The one in the lead, a man with a broken nose and cruel eyes, Billy, smiled a wolfish smile that held no warmth. "Well now," Billy drawled, his voice echoing in the canyon. "Look what the buzzards didn't get. The old shepherd and his little lost lamb." Jacob felt Kesh press her face into his back, trembling. He nudged the mare forward a few steps, putting himself squarely between the girl and the men. "The girl's with me," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. "You've done your business. Ride on." Billy laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Our business? Our business is gold. And that little savage's tribe knows where it is. She's a key, and you're an inconvenience." His eyes flicked to Jacob's horse and gear. "We'll be taking that nag, too. Save you the trouble of riding back alone." The other two miners spread out slightly, flanking them. The trap was closing. Jacob's mind raced. He could maybe get off one shot, but 3 against 1 in a narrow canyon, with a child behind him? It was a suicide mission. He was calculating the angle, the timing, his finger itching near the trigger of his rifle, when he felt Kesh move. She let out a sudden, piercing shriek, not of fear, but a high, ululating war cry that shattered the tense silence. It was a sound meant to freeze blood. At the same moment, she flung out her arm, pointing dramatically up at the canyon rim, her face a mask of terrified urgency. She screamed a torrent of Apache, her voice cracking with what sounded like desperate warnings. The miners, startled by the sudden explosion of sound, instinctively jerked their heads up, their hands going to their weapons, expecting a hail of arrows from above. It was a primal reaction, a fear etched deep in the bones of men who knew they were invaders. That 1 second of distraction was all Jacob needed. He didn't fire at them. He fired above them. The report of the rifle was a deafening cannon blast in the confined space. The bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall with a sharp whine, spraying rock chips. The miners' horses, already spooked by Kesh's cry, reared in panic at the gunshot. The men fought for control, cursing. "The next one finds a home," Jacob roared, working the lever action of his rifle with practiced speed, the chambering of a new round a definitive, metallic threat. Billy, his face contorted with fury, finally got his horse under control. He glared at Jacob, then up at the empty canyon rim. He'd been tricked, outsmarted by a child. "This ain't over, old man," he snarled. "This land ain't big enough for you to hide." But the element of surprise was gone. Their ambush had failed. With a final, venomous look, Billy yanked his horse's head around and spurred it back down the canyon, his 2 companions following in a cloud of dust. The silence they left behind was ringing. Jacob slowly lowered his rifle, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through him. He turned in the saddle. Kesh was looking at him, her chest heaving. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a fierce, blazing pride. He looked at her, truly seeing her, not as a victim, but as a partner, a warrior. She hadn't needed his protection. She had provided the strategy for their salvation. "We can't go to the fort," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They'll be watching every trail. I know a place." He wasn't leading a child to safety anymore. He was following a partner to sanctuary. Jacob led them away from the canyon, not by the known trails, but by a geography written on his soul. He rode up dry washes that looked impassable through thickets of thorny mesquite that clawed at their clothes, always climbing. The sun began its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the broken land. Kesh held on tightly, her head on a swivel, but she no longer looked back in fear. She trusted his direction. They reached a sheer wall of sandstone, fissured and ancient. It looked impenetrable, but Jacob reined in the mare and dismounted, leading the animal towards what appeared to be a solid rock face. As they drew closer, an optical illusion resolved itself, a narrow crack, just wide enough for a man and a horse to slip through sideways. "In here," Jacob said, his voice a low murmur. They squeezed into the opening, and the world changed. They entered a hidden cavern, large enough to stable several horses. The air was cool and carried the faint, clean smell of damp stone. A shaft of light from a hole in the high ceiling illuminated the center of the space, catching motes of dust dancing in the air. It was a sanctuary, silent and secret. "I found this place after," Jacob said, the words echoing softly. He didn't need to say after what. The memory of his loss was the third occupant of the cave. No one else knows. He tended to the mare, his movements calm and routine, a balm against the earlier adrenaline. Kesh stood in the beam of light, her small figure seeming to absorb the quiet peace of the place. She explored the edges of the cavern, running her hands over the smooth, water-carved walls. Jacob built a small, careful fire in a circle of stones, just enough to push back the growing chill of the desert night and to heat a can of beans. The flickering flames painted dancing shapes on the walls, bringing the stone to life. As they ate, the shared danger in the canyon hung between them, but it was a bond now, not a burden. Jacob watched Kesh. The firelight softened her features, but her eyes held a new depth. She was no longer the terrified child he had cut down from the tree. She was a survivor, sharp and resilient. Her gaze fell on his saddlebag, where the sign was stored. She pointed to it. Understanding, Jacob retrieved it. The wooden plaque felt heavier than before, laden with all the stories they had now poured into it. He held it so the firelight played across the harsh, carved letters. "White man, don't forgive." Kesh stood up. She found a piece of stone that had fallen from the ceiling, smooth and dark. Then, she walked to a clean section of the cave wall. She began to draw. She drew with a surprising skill. First, a group of figures with feathered headdresses, her people. Then stick-figure men with pickaxes, the miners. She drew the confrontation, the violence, the tree. She drew herself hanging and the sign around her neck. Jacob watched, his breath caught in his chest. She was etching her testimony into the stone, making her story a permanent part of this hidden world. Then, she drew a new figure, a tall man with a hat. She drew him cutting the ropes. She drew him holding a dipper of water. She drew them riding together. She pointed at the drawing of the man, then at Jacob. Finally, she pointed back to the physical sign in his hands. She pointed to the word, "Don't," and then she shook her head. She pointed to Jacob, and then back to the sign, and shook her head again, more emphatically. The message was unmistakable. "You're not this. You prove this wrong." The simplicity and power of her gesture struck Jacob to his core. She had taken the instrument of her trauma and, through her actions, had redefined it. For her, he had already answered its hateful declaration. He looked down at the sign, the charred edge a testament to his own failed attempt to destroy it. Now he saw it not as something to be burned or hidden, but as something to be changed. He drew his knife from its sheath. The blade gleamed in the firelight. He laid the sign flat on the ground. With the tip of the knife, he began to scrape, not wildly, but with a deliberate, careful precision. He scraped at the word "don't," digging the sharp metal into the grain, carving it out letter by letter. Wood shavings curled away. The negative word began to disappear, leaving a raw, gouged scar in the wood. When he was done, the message was transformed. It now read, "White man, forgive." The ellipsis was a gash of uncertainty. The question mark, carved freshly at the end, was a plea in opening. It was no longer a statement of absolute fact. It was a challenge, a hope. He held it up for her to see. "It's not about them anymore, is it?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The miners, or the raiders who took my family. It's about us, right here, whether we choose to be like them, or something else." Kesh looked from the altered sign to his face. She saw the pain, the struggle, and the hard-won resolve in his eyes. She nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them. They had both made their choice. They had chosen to be something else. In the heart of the hidden cave, surrounded by ancient stone and the soft crackle of the fire, the cycle of vengeance that had defined their lives was broken. Not by a treaty or a victory, but by a question carved into a piece of wood and the quiet, courageous answer that two lost souls had given each other. The ride back to the ranch from the hidden cave was made in a silence that was neither tense nor sad, but full. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, the morning sun warming the red rock canyons, painting the desert in hues of gold and rose. Jacob and Kesh rode together, the altered sign now tucked securely away, its question mark a silent third passenger. As the familiar outline of the cabin came into view, a different kind of tension settled in Jacob's shoulders. It was no longer just a shelter. It had become a home, however temporary, for the two of them. But he knew it was a mirage. Her people would be looking for her, and his world could not contain hers forever. He saw them before they saw him. A dozen Apache warriors on horseback, arrayed in a silent, formidable line before his cabin. They were not attacking. They were waiting. Their stillness was more intimidating than any charge. Jacob's hand twitched, but he did not reach for his rifle. He kept his pace slow and deliberate, his body language calm. He felt Kesh stiffen behind him, then leaned forward, her eyes searching the line of faces. A cry escaped her, a single word that was both a name and a sob. Nayli, an older woman, her hair streaked with silver, but her posture erect and proud, urged her horse forward. Her face was a mask of weathered strength, but her eyes, the same dark, intelligent eyes as Kesh's, were wide with disbelief and dawning joy. This was Naich, her grandmother. Kesh slid from the mare before it had even stopped and ran across the dusty yard, throwing herself into the woman's arms. The reunion was a torrent of weeping, rapid Apache, and desperate embraces. Jacob remained on his horse, a respectful distance away, giving them their moment. The warriors watched him, their expressions unreadable. After a long moment, Naich looked up from her granddaughter, her eyes finding Jacob. She gently guided Kesh behind her and walked her horse toward him. The air crackled. Jacob felt the weight of their gazes, the history of violence that stood between them like a wall. Naich's eyes scanned him, from his worn boots to his weary face. They were not filled with hate, but with a deep, assessing curiosity. Then her gaze fell upon his saddlebag, where the corner of the wooden sign was visible. She pointed a slender, strong finger. "The words," she said, her English slow and heavily accented, but clear. "The words of the Bilagana, who took my son." Jacob nodded slowly. He carefully pulled the sign out, holding it so she could see the altered message. He watched her face as she read the gouged-out scar where "don't" had been, and the carefully carved question mark at the end. "White man, forgive." Naich's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She looked from the sign to Jacob's face, then back to Kesh, who was nodding vigorously, speaking in a low, urgent voice to her grandmother in Apache. She was telling the story, not just of the rescue, but of the water pump, the shared words, the canyon, the cave. Naich listened, her face an impassive stone. When Kesh finished, the old woman was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the altered sign. The question hung in the air between the two groups, a fragile bridge over a chasm of old blood. Finally, Naich gestured to one of the warriors, who brought forward a small, beautifully beaded pouch of soft, white deerskin. Intricate patterns of stars and dancers were sewn into it with exquisite care. She held out to Jacob. Her voice, when she spoke, was thick with emotion she refused to let show. "My son, her father, he carried this." She tapped her chest over her heart. He believed in the question. He died for it. She paused, her eyes glistening in the sun. "You have given me back my granddaughter. You have answered his question, not with words, but with this." She gestured to the space between him and Kesh, to the trust that had been built. "The circle of hate is broken here. On this ground." Jacob reached out and took the pouch. It was soft, almost weightless, but it felt like the heaviest, most significant thing he had ever held. It was not a peace treaty between nations. It was a gift from one grieving soul to another. A recognition. Naich gave a sharp, graceful nod. The warriors turned their horses as one. Kesh looked back at Jacob, her small face a storm of emotions. Happiness to be returning to her people, sorrow at leaving the gruff, kind man who had saved her in more ways than one. She ran back to him one last time. He leaned down from the saddle. "Shah," she said, pointing toward his well. "Water. You, Shah, you are water. Life. Sustenance." He understood. He managed a small, tight smile, the gesture feeling strange on his face. Kesh, you can always find water here. She held his gaze for a final, long moment, then turned and ran to her grandmother's horse, was pulled up, and the Apache band moved off, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze without a backward glance. Jacob sat on his horse for a long time, the beaded pouch held gently in his hand. The yard was empty again. The silence had returned, but it was a different silence. He dismounted and walked slowly into the cabin. The emptiness echoed, but it no longer felt hollow. He walked to the fireplace and looked at the daguerreotype on the mantelpiece, still turned face down. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over the dusty frame. For 20 years, the pain had been a wall he could not breach. Now, with a breath that felt like his first in decades, he carefully, tenderly, lifted the frame and set it upright. Mary and Tommy smiled out at him. The pain was still there, a deep and permanent scar. But for the first time, it was accompanied not by bitterness, but by love. He had not betrayed them by protecting Kesh. He had honored them. He walked back outside, standing on the porch. The vast land stretched out before him, the same land that had taken everything from him. But now, he did not see a fortress to be defended. He saw a home. The wind whispered through the grasses, no longer a mournful cry, but a song of possibility. Jacob Prentice was alone again, but the loneliness had been scoured out of him, replaced by a quiet, enduring peace. The question had been asked, and in the heart of a lonely rancher and a young Apache girl, it had found its answer.